So, growing up as a Gulf Coast kid, Hurricane Katrina stands large in my memory. It happened 11 years ago, last month, in the summer of 2005. I went off to college just before it happened, and so I watched the whole thing, as many did, on television from Williamsburg, Virginia. But it affected me deeply. I had been in New Orleans just a month and a half before the storm hit, and then I watched Hurricane Rita directly hit my hometown of Houston, Texas. And so that time in, summer of 2005, it was a big deal to me. I know what it is to ride out a hurricane, and that was a particularly rough one. Now, what made it particularly rough in New Orleans has, in subsequent years, been proven to be largely preventable. Obviously, we can't redirect the path of a storm, but a lot of what caused the damage in New Orleans was preventable. When they built the levees, they had a theoretical rating of a Category 4 storm. Now, this is the Gulf of Mexico, and this is the Gulf Coast, and you are likely to get hit by more than a Category 4 storm, right? There have been 3 or 4 in my lifetime that have narrowly or hit New Orleans that were Category 4 or Category 5. And so the levees themselves didn't start out in a way that was likely to protect New Orleans from a Hurricane Katrina, which was a Category 4 storm. On top of that, further investigations have shown that maybe that Category 4 rating was optimistic to begin with, that those levees may not have been able to hold to a Category 4 even in the best of circumstances. In fact, when I was there a month and a half before Katrina, the bridge across Lake Pontchartrain was shut down because of a hurricane that was hitting Florida. So there's a Hurricane Dennis in Florida, we're in New Orleans, and we can't get across the bridge into New Orleans because of a storm that far away. There was a human failure that amplified the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina. And I got to see some of that tragedy firsthand as an aid worker, tearing rotted drywall off of houses and moving out rotten fridges and all kinds of stuff. I mean, I saw the depth of that tragedy, and so much of it was not from wind. So much of it was from storm surge and flooding, both related to these faulty levees. Now, you can talk about, and no doubt the politicians hadn't, and I'm not particularly interested in that discussion, but we know that there was either a lack of foresight, right? When would a hurricane of 4+ hit New Orleans? Or some sort of institutional inertia, right? Well, they've always been fine, they'll continue being fine. Or some amount of corruption. I am willing to bet it was some combination of all three. But either way, it was some people knew this might be an issue. Some spoke out, some didn't. Nothing was done. And a great human tragedy took place, or a great human tragedy was amplified. Human brokenness, then, bears a great amount of responsibility for what happened in New Orleans in 2005 and the scope of that devastation. The storm was coming. At that point, there was nothing they could do. They weren't ready. The levees weren't going to hold. And an entire generation of New Orleans residents and an entire city still bear the scars 11 years later. I tell this story not because it's simply deeply tragic, but because it's very relevant to what's happening in the book of Jeremiah this morning. You see, Jeremiah is crying out to God. But he's crying out to God for a very specific reason. You see, he spent the first 7.5 chapters of Jeremiah trying to get God's people to avoid disaster. They have not been behaving as they are supposed to. In this case, they have moved foreign idols into the temple, which, the God politics at the time, not a great idea. Jeremiah has been spending a lot of time saying, hey, if you don't do something different, you guys are going to get invaded and crushed. Hey, in stronger words, if you don't do something different, if you don't turn away, if you let your brokenness be what wins the day, things are not going to go well for you. You might want to consider doing something different. And now here he is in the middle of chapter 8 through the beginning of chapter 9, and their fate is sealed. There's nothing that can be done now. They're going to get invaded and crushed. The army is on the way. And so that's the context in which Jeremiah probably originally spoke and then had recorded these words. My joy is gone. Grief is upon me. My heart is sick. Hark, the cry of my people from far and wide in the land. Is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king not in her? Why have they provoked me to anger with their images and with their foreign idols? The harvest is past, the summer is ended, and we are not saved. For the hurt of my people, I am hurt. I mourn in dismay. I mourn, and dismay has taken hold of me. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there? Why then has the health of my poor people not been restored? Oh, that my head were a spring of water, and my eyes a fountain of tears, so that I might weep day and night for the slain of my poor people. Jeremiah is crying out to God. But he's not crying out to God for help. He's crying out just to cry. And what he expresses within that cry is that the people didn't turn away. Their brokenness won out. And so the storm is coming. The levees will not hold. And an entire generation of God's people, many generations of God's people, will bear the scars of that. And there's an interjection, and if you followed along reading it, you might have seen it. There's a part, at least in my version of the text, that is in parentheses. And this means there's a change in voice. Most of this poem is spoken in the voice of the prophet Jeremiah, who is bringing God's words to God's people, but is speaking for himself. The parentheses, which are there in verse 19, is God talking directly to God's people. Why have they provoked me to anger with their images, with their foreign idols? This is a reminder from God of what caused the tragedy. It was humanity's reliance on their own brokenness rather than turning back towards God that brought the armies upon them. They had that opportunity to turn. They had Jeremiah proclaiming in various ways, hey, you might want to consider a different path. And they didn't. And so here they are in this situation. They did not turn away. And so Jeremiah is left asking the question that, if you know this scripture at all, is the line that has been remembered most. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no balm in Gilead? So Gilead, not just a random name here. Gilead actually had a special type of tree that a special ointment was made from, and that was used for healing. And so Gilead was the medical center of its day. And so that's why that name is in there. Gilead is known for having had a particular medicine that people would have heard of. And so that's why Gilead. But that question gets asked, is there no balm in Gilead? And I think if you read Jeremiah's words and listen carefully, his answer seems to be no. There is no balm in Gilead. This rhetorical question has an answer, and it's no. There's no balm in Gilead. You guys are going to be invaded. It's not going to go well. I think we can all summon images of tragedies like this, right? Where human brokenness has caused great harm in this world. When a failure to turn away from brokenness and towards God has deeply scarred humanity. Certainly we talked about Hurricane Katrina at the top of this sermon. The Holocaust comes to mind, certainly. The Rwandan genocide, 9/11 we talked about last week. That we prayed about last week. In each of those instances, human brokenness ruled. And it's not that God wasn't speaking in those situations. It's not that God wasn't telling people, hey, you might consider a different direction. We can, if you comb through the history books, there have been pastors and leaders in each of those scenarios saying exactly those kinds of things. But those words weren't heeded. That opportunity to turn towards God and God's will was not heeded. And so we all, in some ways, bear scars of that brokenness. This functions not just on the great geopolitical level, although Jeremiah is talking in terms of geopolitics here. It also functions, and much more commonly, on that deeply personal level, right? And for me, I have my own story of times where my own brokenness has gotten in the way of something important, where I have let my own brokenness get in the way. When I was a teenager, late teenager, 17, 18, 19, I was very certain that I was going to marry a girl. Her name was Diane. We had been best friends for a long time before that, and I was utterly convinced that we were going to get married and spend our life together. This was fundamental to how I imagined my life post-high school. We were going to both go through college, get married at some point in there, and then start a life together. That was my plan. I am a long-range planner. That was my plan. But it didn't work out that way. You see, that's what I really wanted. And so I ran my end of that relationship solely with that goal in mind, us ending up together in some sort of happily ever after. Did I pray about this? No. Did I have friends telling me that this is a terrible idea? Yes, of course, absolutely. Was Diane even trying to communicate in her own way that this was most likely a terrible plan and did not capture what was right about this relationship? Absolutely. Did I heed any of these things? Absolutely not. So she went to college a year ahead of me, but the end of my first semester at William & Mary, I got back for the winter break after having been fighting on the phone and over the internet for weeks and months. And she dumped me basically the day she got back in town. Now, I've been dumped before. Big surprise. I've only been dumped once since, so far. But this one was particularly hard. It rocked my sense of self, and it ruined that friendship. I credit Diane with having saved my life several years before that point. We were best friends long before we ever dated. It was a wonderful, life-giving friendship that has had a big impact on my life. Diane and I have spoken exactly 4 times in the last 10 years. 4 times in 10 years. None of them peaceable. I ruined that friendship because I focused on what I wanted in my own broken need. I did not focus on what God wanted for me or what was right in that situation. And I ruined a wonderful friendship that really did have a big impact on me. And so I end up in that point in my own small teenage personal way of asking that same question. Is there no balm in Gilead? Now there's a great spiritual that we're going to sing at the end of this sermon, or at the end of this service, or at least we're all going to stumble through together at the end of this service, that answers that question. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. And now I'm having us sing that hymn because I agree. There is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. But notice what that balm in Gilead heals. Not the situation that's irreparably broken, but the soul within that situation that led to the brokenness. For me, I found that balm, that cure, on the Camino de Santiago. I think I've talked about it in this space before. It's a pilgrimage route across the north of Spain that you walk 500 miles for over 31 days. And in the midst of the Camino, in the midst of walking with God on a pilgrimage for 30 days, I found what it was to rely on God for my life. I found what it was to let God set the direction for my life. I found healing for the relationship that I lost, while also taking ownership of my role in that loss. God offered me healing on the Camino, that I was able to come back, and actually Sydney and I started dating less than a month afterwards. But I found that healing to heal my sin-sick soul. It didn't change the fact that my brokenness had ruined a thing, that my reliance on my own wants and needs, rather than on God's will, had done irreparable damage. It's not like Diane and I are friends to this day. Quite the opposite. If it weren't for Facebook, I'd have no idea what was going on in her life. But I found healing. I found that balm by turning towards God. And so that's the healing that's offered. There is a balm in Gilead. It is each of us recognizing our need for God and turning in that direction. There is always that chance to turn, even after something tragic has happened. God is still there. That's part of why it's important to note that God interjects into Jeremiah's speech. Yes, human brokenness consistently applied can ruin things. But God speaks through Jeremiah, and God speaks directly to us, reminding us that God is still there. We may have walked away, but God's hand still reaches out. And so Jeremiah, in a way, teaches us something about how to talk to God, right? I attend church a lot, and I carefully watch people. And something I've learned over the years, over the dozens of churches I've been to, is people always walk into churches as if everything is totally fine, right? That everything is totally fine. We're happy, smiley people. Even if we're not happy, smiley people on the inside. Statistically speaking, that's not true. And we pray that way too. I hear it when we offer up prayer requests. We have our joys, which we really celebrate. And then we have our concerns, but we always want to rush to, yes, but we know and trust that it's going to be okay, it's going to be fine. We rush to the end. We don't think it's okay to sit in the midst of the pain and tragedy. We rush to the end and leave out that real process of healing. Jeremiah doesn't do that. Jeremiah is just crying to cry. Crying out to God, going, God, not using the Lord's name in vain, he's addressing God. God, things are awful. The people have really messed it up. I'm really hurting. This is really bad. He doesn't say, but it's going to get better. He rhetorically thinks it won't. But he still talks to God. If you ever come to me or any counselor for relationship advice, the counselor is going to tell you the same thing, that communication matters, right? The core to any functional relationship is communication. And core to a functional relationship with God is communication. Communication when you're thankful for things, absolutely. We're not particularly good at that either, but that's a different sermon. That's the Thanksgiving sermon. We're really good at asking for things that we want, but we're really bad at telling God how we're really feeling, because it's like we don't think the divine wants to know. But core to a good relationship is telling the other person, the other entity, things they may or may not want to hear. So I invite you that when you pray to God, pray openly to God. Pray what you're really feeling to God. Let God heal your sin-sick soul. Let God make your wounds whole by honestly expressing what's going on. If you ever need bedtime reading, I invite you to read all of the Psalms, all 137 of them. Some of them will be like the 23rd Psalm that we read last week. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Things are great, God protects me. Yeah, that's in there, and that's true. But you will also hear these wonderful statements that simply say this: God, where are you? God, I don't see you. God, your face is hidden from me. Why are you hiding your face? Things are terrible. I think I'm on fire. And then it doesn't resolve to something nice and pretty. These are the Psalms that often get left out of the lectionary. But they're there. They're part of our biblical witness. They're part of our story of how our ancestors before us maintained their relationship with God even when human brokenness won the day. It's the way our ancestors, it's the way Jeremiah allowed God to heal his wounded soul. And so really I have a two-part invitation this morning. I invite us all to consistently turn towards God in all things, to trust in God in all things, and to truly pray our hearts to God so that we may truly hear from God the directions we are to go. For there is a balm in Gilead to heal the sin-sick soul. There is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded